there's a theory Carl Jung wrote that almost no one talks about. It wasn't hidden in his public lectures, it wasn't printed in bold ink across the collected works. It lived in the margins, whispered in the shadows of his Red Book, and only explicitly appeared in 1917, in a short but potent chapter he titled simply, The Sexual Theory. But this wasn't a theory about sex, it was about lust, and what lies underneath it. To Jung, lust was not just a carnal urge. It was not something to be banished, repressed, or cleansed through morality. Lust was a spirit, a demon, a cosmic force that lived beneath the surface of all psychic life, shaping our dreams, our conflicts, our visions of God. And this is why the theory remained so forbidden, because it reframed one of humanity's most judged instincts, not as evil, but as divine. In this essay, we're going to unpack what Jung really meant when he wrote that Eros was a great spirit. We'll look at why he believed lust was not an obstacle to spirituality, but its secret beginning. And we'll see how, in his own language, Jung described the very soul of human consciousness as being born through erotic tension. This is not about pleasure. This is not about repression. This is about the lust daemon, the archetype that lives at the root of our desires, and the ancient spirit Jung believed we must one day face if we ever wish to become whole. In the beginning was Eros, Jung wrote, paraphrasing the Gospel of John with radical boldness, and for him, this wasn't metaphor. Eros, the Greek god of love, passion, and desire, was not just a myth. He was a symbol of something deeper, a living archetype, a spirit that moves between the realms of heaven and earth. In his Red Book, Jung describes Eros not as a feeling or a drive, but as a demon between gods and humans, a being whose task is to unite what is split, to bring together the opposites, matter and spirit, male and female, good and evil, God and man. In myth, Eros is the child of chaos and Gaia, the product of the void and the fertile ground. In Jung's psychology, this translates into a profound insight that love, and its more primal sibling, lust, are not choices we make. They are the first bridges of consciousness that rise out of the unconscious. They are not beneath us. They are older than us. To feel lust in this sense is not simply to want. It is to be moved by the ancient demon that calls us out of isolation, out of separation, and into contact with another, with the world, with ourselves. And it is terrifying, because once we are in contact, we begin to change. We become vulnerable. We are seen. We feel shame. We feel obsession. We fall into madness. We feel desire not only for flesh, but for something we can't name. This is what Jung meant by saying that lust was spiritual. It was the pull of the soul toward union, toward something outside the self that promised completion. And yet, this demon, this Eros, is not tame. It cannot be commanded. It does not follow laws. It is the force that leads us into our greatest transformations, but it can also destroy us if we resist it or worship it blindly. For Jung, this is where modern psychology failed. It reduced sex to biology. It reduced love to chemicals. But Jung saw what the ancients saw, that there is a spiritual intelligence behind our erotic longing, that the desire we feel is not just for another body, but for something eternal hiding behind the mask of the other. Eros, then, is not a human trait. It is a transpersonal force, a mythic pattern, a demon that enters us, not to destroy our reason, but to break it open, to wound the ego so that the soul can speak. Lust, then, was never merely instinct for Jung. It was not the raw appetite that needed to be tamed, as so many traditions had insisted. Nor was it just a biological mechanism for reproduction. Lust, to Jung, was the first fire, the spark that awakens the psyche to its own depths. It's easy to misunderstand this, because in our culture, lust is flattened into something crude, often linked to shame, perversion, or weakness. But Jung wasn't looking at lust as an act. He was looking at its symbolic nature, its psychic presence. And when he examined that presence, what he saw was not filth or sin, but a doorway into the soul. In his 1917 note, he wrote of a sexual theory, but what he was really pointing to was Eros as a principle of transformation. not just in relationships or fantasies, but in the entire arc of becoming. Lust, in this sense, was the first messenger, the first crack in the shell of unconsciousness. Before lust, we live in a kind of Eden, untouched, unconscious, neutral. But lust emerges like the serpent. It seduces us, awakens us, and drives us out of that false peace. It brings longing, but it also brings separation. The first experience of I want is also the first experience of I am not whole, and in that gap between the self and the desired, consciousness is born. This is what Jung found so profound, that lust is not a fall from grace, it is grace itself breaking the silence of the psyche. To feel desire is to feel the self split, but from that split, something grows, the individual, the ego, the soul. Lust forces us to see the difference between the inner and the outer, between longing and fulfillment, between image and reality. And in navigating that tension, we begin to develop the symbolic life, the life where instincts are no longer just acted upon, but understood. Yet, with understanding comes anxiety. With awareness comes guilt. This is the price of knowing, not because we are bad, but because we can now see. And once you see, you can't go back. This is why Jung believed that lust, like the god Eros, was a demon, not in the Christian sense of evil, but in the ancient Greek sense of an autonomous psychic force that bridges two worlds. Lust is not evil, but it is dangerous, not because it corrupts, but because it transforms. And anything that transforms us, anything that has the power to dissolve who we think we are, will always be met with fear. Jung himself wrestled with this. In his own fantasies and inner dialogues, he often encountered feminine figures who embodied the force of erotic mystery. Salome, the anima, the serpent woman archetype. These visions were not indulgent. They were initiatory. They pushed him to confront his own moral structures, his own fears, his own shadow. And at the heart of that shadow was a truth that few dared say aloud, that the sacred and the sexual are not enemies. They are intertwined. This is why Jung's theory remains so forbidden, because it dares to suggest that the road to God does not bypass lust, it passes directly through it, that the spirit does not rise by denying the body, but by encountering it fully. That eros is not the antithesis of logos, it is its awakener. We can only truly think, Jung suggests, once we have felt, once we have been touched by that deeper, irrational force that breaks the ego's illusion of autonomy. Lust is the wound, but it is also the opening, the passageway into the unknown. And so, lust is not just a problem to solve, it's a message to decode, a psychic eruption, a visitation from something older than civilization itself. And if we fail to understand it, if we banish it into the unconscious, it doesn't disappear. It festers, it becomes obsession, it mutates into shadow. Jung warned of this in the clearest terms. When we repress the erotic, it doesn't purify us, it fragments us. What we call sin is often just the shadow of something sacred we could not integrate. And nowhere is this more obvious than in religious and moral traditions that treat desire as pollution. When lust is not made conscious, it possesses us. It turns into projection, onto lovers, celebrities, saints, strangers. We begin to see our own demon in the other, and we mistake it for love or hatred or need. But it was never about them. It was the demon trying to return to the center of the psyche, trying to be seen. Jung's insight was that this possession is not simply a personal failing. It's a natural part of the individuation process. The psyche needs the daemon. The daemon carries the libido, not just sexual energy, but psychic life force. Without it, we become hollow, rational, lifeless. We lose the fire, and in doing so, we become moral, but dead inside. To restore the balance, Jung said, we must face the demon. We must meet it not as sin, but as symbol, not as temptation, but as transformation. This is not about acting out every desire. That would be regression. It is about entering into dialogue with the archetype behind the desire, the image, the myth, the force. He once said, "We don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And the lust demon, in all its seductive, terrifying beauty, is one of those shadows we are asked to confront. Because what happens when we do? We find that lust is not really about another person. It's about the soul's longing for reunion, the yearning for what was lost when the ego was born. We want the other. But underneath that want is something more ancient, the desire to become whole. The Greeks called it eros. The Gnostics called it Sophia. Jung called it the anima, the soul image, the inner feminine, the bridge between the conscious and the unconscious. And she often appears in dreams or visions as the erotic figure, not because the psyche is vulgar, but because it is honest. The erotic image is the most direct symbol of union, of merging, of dissolving the boundaries of me and not me. And this is why it is also the most frightening, because to truly follow it, to truly enter into the erotic with awareness, means letting go of control. It means death, not of the body, but of the rigid ego. And this is the danger Jung pointed to, that we might either reject the daemon entirely and become numb, repressed, moralistic, or worship it blindly, and become enslaved, addicted, consumed. Both are forms of shadow. Both are symptoms of a split psyche. The only path forward, he said, is integration, not repression, not indulgence, but dialogue. Conscious contact with the daemon, meeting lust not with guilt or fantasy, but with curiosity, with reverence, because it is through this contact that something else is born. A third thing, neither the ego nor the daemon, but a bridge between them, a new self, a self that has passed through the fire and come out the other side, not untouched, but transformed. This is what Jung meant when he said, the God image must be redeemed, not denied, not destroyed, but purified, because the daemon of lust, like the image of God, is distorted when we only see it through the lens of fear. It becomes monstrous, but it was never monstrous. It was only raw, untamed, holy. To face the lust, demon is to reclaim the soul's original fire, to accept that we are not sterile minds floating above the world, but incarnate beings, pulled by gravity, stirred by longing, wounded by love, and made whole only when we stop pretending otherwise. This is not heresy, it is healing. The moment we stop fearing lust is the moment we begin to understand what it really is. It is not simply the drive for pleasure, it is the soul's language for longing, the echo of a unity we once knew, and now ache to return to. But this return cannot happen through regression. We cannot go back to innocence. We must go forward, through the tension, through the heat, through the demon's fire. The diamond tests us. It does not hand us peace, it hands us contradiction, the pull of opposites, the war between spirit and flesh, the wound between love and instinct, and in that tension, the soul either collapses or it awakens. Jung saw this awakening not as enlightenment in the traditional sense, but as individuation, the slow, painful, honest process of becoming a whole human being. And there can be no wholeness without eros, no wholeness without the daemon, no wholeness without lust. He once said that the gods have become diseases, that what was once divine has now been pathologized, and nowhere is this truer than with sexuality. What was once worshipped, honored, even feared as sacred, has been reduced to shame or addiction or noise. But Jung reversed the path. He dared to re-sacralize what modernity had rejected. He looked into the eye of the erotic and saw not danger, but initiation. He saw the serpent, not as the deceiver, but as the awakener. He saw the forbidden fruit, not as a sin, but as a key. He saw Eve, not as the cause of the fall, but as the bearer of eros, the first light of self-awareness. And in doing so, he reframed the entire myth of Genesis. The fall was not a punishment. It was a passage, a psychological necessity, a rupture that allowed consciousness to emerge. And lust was the spark. This is why the theory remains forbidden, because it reveals something most systems of control cannot accept, that truth often comes through the body, through desire, through the irrational places where the soul speaks loudest. And if we fear that voice, we will always remain split. But if we listen, If we learn to sit with the fire, something happens. The daemon softens, the symbols shift, the longing becomes luminous. We begin to see that what we called lust was never just about the other. It was the soul's hunger for itself. The desire to remember what it means to be alive, not just in mind, but in mystery. And this is Jung's ultimate message, that we must redeem not only the shadow of God, but the shadow of ourselves. That lust, desire, erotic tension, these are not flaws to erase, but invitations to evolve. The demon is not here to destroy you. It is here to shape you, to carve the hollow that the light can enter. So the next time longing burns through your chest, pause. Don't reach for escape. Don't numb it. Don't shame it. Ask instead, what is this desire trying to show me? What image lives behind it? What part of me have I forgotten that it's trying to return? Because behind the lust, behind the ache, behind the hunger, is not a monster. It is the sacred. And if you have the courage to look it in the eye, the demon will become a guide.